Welcome back. Ask Coach Nate, episode number 11. Today, we're going to focus on discussing devices for endurance sports and how they can improve your training ability. So, Nate, why don't we just start off by covering the basics of what devices are available and how people might use those devices to improve their training.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't know, it's pretty exciting. I think these days that there's so many devices that are pretty economical for most like people that are engaged in running or cycling. So there's a lot of good options that are way better than they have been in the past. But I think that the core like three that most people would think about would be a GPS computer of some sort, a heart rate monitor of some sort, and for cycling at least a power meter. Again, which there are a few different varieties, and that's even something on the horizon possibly for runners. I think it'll be less useful for runners, but that's something that exists and I'm sure is going to continue to be developed because there's an interest in that kind of a product among runners, and anyone that can make money on it, that can make a affordable power meter that's effective is for sure going to do that. So we'll see that increasingly available. But yeah, I mean, those are like the key things that, especially for your actual training sessions, are going to be the most useful and the most obvious that you'll see a lot of cyclists will have, GPS, heart rate, and power. And then you'll see some people will use just one or the other, like heart rate or power.
Yeah, I think, the shoe power meters I'm very excited about. I know I was even looking into getting some. I'd love to test them because I am a self-professed endurance sports measurement geek. It's one of my favorite aspects of the sport. There's just so many metrics to use to optimize your workouts. And the only thing I would add is power meters are like relatively new, right? They were in the pro peloton maybe 15, 20 years ago. A lot of rumors that Armstrong was one of the first people to start using them. They were really expensive. And then heart rate has been around a lot longer, right? So if you do a lot of Google searches about this stuff, you'll see a lot of heart rate information because that was how training had been done for like a pretty long time with cycling and with running. So Nate, why don't you break down perhaps like the history and maybe some of the differences, right? Because you do have two ways to measure performance with heart rate and power. So let's just help people understand the differences between the two, what they're good at, what they're not good at, and what to expect.
Yeah. So, I mean, like you say, heart rate's been around for a long time. I think it's just like a convenient artifact of the human body that you can measure electrical impulses on the skin relatively easily. So you can get a heart rate monitor for pretty cheap. And then more recently, you have optical heart rate monitors that will check for blood flow at the skin, usually on your wrist or arm. And so that's great because it tells you like what the aerobic demand is of the activity you're doing. So relative to whatever your max heart rate is, your threshold heart rate is, you can kind of tell how hard that intensity is that you're doing on an aerobic basis at any given moment. And there's obviously a lag. So if you you jump up and you start going running, like you'll see your heart rate rise for a few minutes or several minutes until it kind of plateaus and it stays steady. So there's a little bit of a limitation there, but that also does tell you something that a power meter won't tell you, for example, and it tells you like how much aerobic reserve you have and like how much like of a phosphate energy system you have developed to buffer and prevent your heart rate from like skyrocketing right out the door. But power meters, yeah, they're more expensive. They have come down a lot in price, but they are still more expensive than heart rate. And they've been around for like over 30 years now. But yeah, you're right. It was like a pretty elite activity to have a heart rate or to have a power meter and to use that in training back in the day. I mean, at that time, like a power meter would cost as much as a nice bike. And so it's the whole story has changed a lot. You can get a heart rate monitor for less than $100. You can get a power meter for like $300 to $500 potentially, and then a GPS computer, and it costs less than a power meter would have cost back in like the 90s or even around 2000. But they're nice because they tell you objectively like how much work you're doing, the rate of work that you're engaged in at any given moment. And so it's outside of taking a look at your time on climbs, it's maybe the most objective way to measure the performance that you're engaged in on any given day and at any given moment. But then on their own, power meters don't necessarily tell you where that energy is coming from. So that's one way that having heart rate along with power can slightly enhance your understanding of what you're doing at any given moment. Because like if you're doing 300 watts and I'm doing 300 watts, like we're doing the same thing, but because my threshold is a lot higher than yours, like metabolically, it's very different. Our body's response to that kind of training is going to be very different. So I am somebody that appreciates using both. And I think that the historical development and the relative cost of the two technologies has made people's interest in power disproportionately outweighed the value that we place on heart rate. I think they're both very useful tools. And then GPS computers are amazing, and they've been around for less time than both of those, but they've become quite cheap, relatively speaking. And those are great because you can both track heart rate and power, or one or the other, whatever devices you have while you're doing your session. So like, I think that that has been a great tool for a lot of people where they can divorce themselves from just looking at like speed and cadence like they might have had on an older cycling computer like 15 years ago, where that's maybe all that they had to look at. Now you can look at like how long it took you to go up a climb, what your power was, what your heart rate was, and you can track all of that over time. And I think that that is an amazing feature, and makes it much easier to see kind of what your objective progress is in a way that hasn't been the case in I don't know, back like 10 years ago or 15 years ago, because you can see like, oh, did I go up the climb faster than I did last year? Did I go up the climb at the same power or with more power? Was my heart rate the same or lower? And you can kind of tell, like, even if I don't know, even if things maybe look similar in one or two dimensions, but they're better in another dimension, you can tell that you're making progress in certain areas where if you only had one of those data points, it would be harder to tell.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the GPS bike computer. Like, when I was a kid, they weren't around, right? Or they were really expensive. But like, I think today, like, I can't even imagine riding a bike without one now, right? Heart rate and power is interesting. It's great for my training, and I love it. But like, I could ride my bike without it. The GPS stuff is like, it's fascinating to think of a world without it, right? Like, it's enabled so many things I think we take for granted. I think my favorite example of like what I think GPS bike computers enabled was an excellent race called the Nifty 1050 in in Berkeley, right? You know what I'm talking about? It's like for people
Yeah.
that don't know this kind of underground challenge or competitive ride. It's where you take the top 10 steepest hills in Berkeley and people race up all of them in one ride. So it's 10,000 feet of climbing and 50 miles, hence the name Nifty 1050. But what's so fascinating about it is like the only way you could figure something like that out is by having GPS bike computers and a really large data set available from lots of people riding bicycles over every single piece of road that's possible to ride on. And then a bunch of cycling geeks got together one night and were like, let's find all the steepest hills in 50 miles. And then they were able to do it. Right. So for me, like, I just love the story and the narrative that like having GPS bicycle computers and then this sea of data where like basically now every road has been ridden and we have numbers on exactly how steep it is, like in addition to like all of the leaderboards and those types of things. So it's allowed people to do like what I think are really kind of fun, like I said, geeky type rides, like a nifty 1050.
Yeah, totally. And I feel like that's a nice thing about both GPS and power is that it allows people to see how they stack up against other athletes in a way that I don't know, just having very limited data where it's like, oh, you go do a time trial 4 or 5 times a year, or you do a couple of hill climbs, and then it's like, oh, I stacked up against these local cyclists in this way. Now on Strava, you can see literally like 10,000 people have ridden up Tunnel Road, and you can see exactly where you are on the leaderboard, and you can tell, and you can look up those people and see like if they race or like what other rides that they do. And you can do that with power as well, where you can see like, oh, what's my peak power for like 1 minute or 10 minutes or 20 minutes and see how that stacks up against other people. And now that there's a more ubiquitous use of power meters, you can go beyond like the Coggin power chart where he and Hunter Allen have this chart about like, oh, like you're an elite level athlete if you can do this amount of power for this amount of time, and you're like a strong amateur or you're a beginner, like depending on how much power you have. And it's like, well, that's cool, but you don't know where that stacks you up in the bell curve of like the power distribution of cyclists. Now you can look up like if you can do 400 watts for 5 minutes, are you in the 90th percentile or the 75th percentile? In a way that's much more interesting and useful.
Yeah, you can. I know it's incredible, right? And none of that was available like even 10 years ago. A combination of having all these things like low cost and now available for the average person, and then all the data like together in the cloud. Like
Yeah.
it's really fascinating. Okay, so we've talked a lot about power meters and heart rate. If someone's just getting started, like what do you recommend, and what device should they get?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of good devices out there. If somebody was a multi-sport athlete and they're not yet sure that they're going to go like all in, and they don't have a big budget to start with, or they're just not sure they want to commit a big budget, I would probably start with a GPS watch if they're a multi-sport athlete so they can use it for running and cycling. But if they're primarily or exclusively a cyclist, I would start with just a decent GPS computer that has the capacity to read signals from heart rate monitors and power meters, so you have the ability to add those later. Or if you just go right off the bat and get like a heart rate monitor, that's a really cheap add-on that, for like less than $200, you could have a GPS computer and a heart rate monitor strap and get a lot of very useful data and be like very intentional and very specific about your training in a way that will get you like 98% of the way there. But after that, like if you really want to go all in or you have a big budget, I would get all three, like get a GPS computer, heart monitor, and a power meter. But power meters cost, generally twice as much as the GPS computer and heart rate together. So it depends on what budget seems reasonable for you. And then each of those tools are like only useful insofar as they like collect data, but you need to do something with the data. So there's options for that either online, or you can download stuff and have it tracked on your computer. But generally the easiest is to just integrate everything with Strava for most people.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think I first started riding like most people. I recorded my ride on my phone with Strava, so I couldn't look at the data.
Yeah.
And I bought a really cheap like bicycle computer that all it did was connect to my phone and it showed me the data. And like it only worked for I don't know, like 3 months or something. I think I even broke one, sent it back, and got another one, and that broke too. Because I was doing like 100-mile rides, and like it just clearly wasn't meant for that level of use. Like I think it died during like a 100-mile ride, like at like mile 90. And then I got a new one, and then the same thing, like it died. And then I just broke down and got a real bike computer. And that's been fantastic. I've actually had the same Wahoo computer from when I started a couple years ago, and that's worked great for me.
Yeah, I feel like that's a key point for beginners. Like I have worked a lot with the high schoolers who don't necessarily go out and buy like a $150 GPS computer. And I've spent a lot of time in the past working at the shop in Berkeley, and like a lot of beginner cyclists just get Strava on their phone. But it's like, if you are only doing hour or 2 hour rides at the most, like that could be fine. And you're just trying to track like your mileage and your time on some climbs. But if you're trying to do like 4 or 5 hour rides, like you don't want to kill your phone battery, and you want to be able to look at the data on your handlebar while you're doing it, which is one reason why if you're primarily or exclusively a cyclist, having a GPS computer that's on your handlebars, it's much better than having it on your wrist, where it's like, oh, what are you going to do? Like take your hand off the bar to like look at your wrist every like few minutes. Like that would be really annoying.
Yeah, I think the other feature that the bike computer worked really well with was when I wanted to do some like century rides and things that had complicated routes, and the route
map features.
Yeah, those are really useful. I think I did one route and I did one ride, and the route was super complex. And like, I was very lucky. I remember I found this guy and he was complaining with me too about how complicated it was, but he had GPS computer and I didn't. So I just followed him the whole way. And that was how I was doing some of these rides. I was like, maybe I should invest in my own computer so I don't get lost. Cause some of the rides have really ridiculous routes that are difficult
Yeah.
to manage on your own. So that was a nice feature.
Yeah, that's one thing to be aware of. Like if people are looking for GPS computer, like cheaper ones will track where you're going, but they won't have advanced mapping features. They might be able to show you like in relative terms, like where you are and show like a line of like what route you're doing, but it won't show you like street names and it won't actually have a map embedded on there. So you would need your phone for navigation. The more expensive GPS computers that are like $300 or $400 would have mapping features where you could actually navigate entirely on the GPS computer.
Yeah, I totally recommend it. Like if you do a lot of those rides, it'll alert you and it'll give you a readout for how many feet or meters, obviously if you put it in metric, until the turn. That part was great because sometimes it's hard to figure out where you want to make the turn. So the technology's come a really long way. When it comes to watches, like, have you had experience with that? Like, I know some cyclists actually use a watch pretty regularly in terms of how they track the rides. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've had two primary watch experiences. One back a few years ago when I retired from professional cycling and planned on moving into triathlon, which unfortunately was derailed with a hip injury. And luckily I can still run, I can still ride, but at least at the time it made it impossible to do that for a time. But the watch that I had was nice in that it was ANT plus compatible, so it could read a power meter and a heart rate monitor, so I could use it for all three disciplines, and I could use a heart rate monitor strap for the heart rate, which was more accurate than an optical sensor that's embedded in the product. Now I don't use that because there's a really high correlation, like much higher in running than there is in cycling, between your pace and the intensity that you're doing and your heart rate. Like it's just really, really closely tied because running is much more aerobic and you're generally using much less strength and less anaerobic systems unless you're going really intensely. So there's less of a divergence there than there is on the bike. So I have just a wristwatch. I have a Garmin Vivo Sport, which I actually got because my partner got one. And I realized that it's cool because it's pretty economical. It tracks GPS so you can go out and do runs or rides. The heart rate I don't find is very accurate when I'm active. Like if I'm running, it's like it just reads high. Like I think the movement like messes it up a little bit. It's whatever. But it tracks heart rate the rest of the day, which is cool. And it tracks your sleep, which I find very useful. And I wear it like 99% of the time so I can see how much I slept. And even if there's a measurement error, it also gives you an idea at least of how much deep sleep and REM sleep you got, which I think is nice to indicate like the quality of your sleep that you're getting. And it was like, I got a refurbished one for like less than $100.
Yeah, I got the Forerunner. I think it's a 735.
Yeah,
tracks sleep. I find the heart rate aspect to be pretty accurate. Like a lot of people say that
it's probably better on the higher end ones, I'm guessing.
Yeah, and then they have specific instructions that say you need to wear it like above there's like a bump in your wrist bone above the bone. And so when I go running, I make sure to make it pretty tight and put it in the right position. Which seems very logical. That would make a huge difference. And then the thing that I liked about a running watch with heart rate is that I can use it to track like spin classes or from traveling. Like there's a whole host of other things you can do.
Yeah.
It took me a while to figure that out one day because I was doing these like soul cycle rides with my wife every once in a while. And I was like, how do I track these into my my routine? And then I realized that if I just had a watch and I turned it on, I at least got heart rate. I haven't spent time like trying to email the manufacturer to figure out if I can get it to connect to the power meters on some of the bikes and stuff.
Yeah.
Which I think there's new versions that do. The old versions like a couple years ago.
Even with Peloton, I saw that there's a third party company making a product that either is out or is coming out soon that will connect Peloton to Zwift, which I thought was kind of funny and like an obvious next
I'll
step.
try that. Peloton, I spent a lot of effort trying to figure out how to convert my Peloton to Training Peaks. So this gets into the next part of the discussion, which is like software, right?
Yeah.
So trying to convert it into Training Peaks, because like Peloton will upload directly to Strava. So okay, you got a bike computer, or you got a GPS watch, you got a heart rate monitor, you got some equipment.
Yeah.
And now what do you do with all that data?
I think for most people, the most fun and easiest to use, and probably like the best interface, is Strava. You can use it for free, or you can get one of their cheaper products and like subscribe to some of the add-on features that they have that you have to pay a few dollars a month for. But you can, automatically upload all of your data, and you see, all the rides that you've done, all the runs that you've done, all the activities you've done. You can see your time on segments. You can see how your time on those segments compares to other people, or even just like seeing your favorite, climb or whatever it is. You can see how you've done over time. Like Strava will just map it all out for you. And that's great. And you can track everything quite easily and pretty much automatically. Like at the end of each session, you just like stop the session, click upload, and all the GPS computers from the last like several years will have like a Wi-Fi function that will just automatically upload to your like home Wi-Fi network, and you don't need to like plug it in anywhere. So that's great. And that's like the first and most important step. And then anything else that you might add on, like heart rate or power, will just be embedded in that same data set if and when you get those things. And you can just upload it and you can track all your power in Strava. If you want a little bit more, well, if you have a coach and you want to be able to share a calendar and, map out workouts and track your workouts, probably Training Peaks is the most popular and most well-established platform for that. There's a few other platforms I've looked at and don't see any huge reason to use any of the other platforms. So personally, I use Training Peaks with my athletes that I work with, and I even have myself as like my own client, so I can look at my own training in there. Mostly just if I want to experiment with looking at different metrics and like mess around with different things, or just like get a read on how well I think that certain features are working in Training Peaks, because like nothing's perfect. Strava and Training Peaks both have very similar metrics as far as like trying to measure the training stress that you're doing and like track your fitness over time. And both of them are useful, but they're also definitely not foolproof. So that's the thing. If you want the most advanced and I don't know, if you want to nerd out on your data a lot, I would probably check out Golden Cheetah, and you can download that for free. It's basically just a bunch of like cycling nerds that know how to program, made a program that has all the features that Strava and Training Peaks would have, plus a bunch of other ones for tracking any kind of metric that you could imagine. But I think for the most part, that's more data, and like it's not necessarily going to help in any way that the other platforms wouldn't, unless you just want to look at all that stuff. But that would be data crunching offline. You would download your rides into your computer to like have them calculate, like have all the metrics calculated on your computer and not online.
Yeah, most people I know use Strava, and I think that's enough for them, right? It tells you like how many miles you rode.
Yeah,
or
there's no reason not to use Strava
in there.
unless you want a shared calendar with a coach or something like that. And like honestly, I think if Strava just made that feature, like just a training plan, like calendar feature that you could share with somebody else, there would be no reason for Training Peaks to have any customers anymore. Like sadly, I think that's my opinion. I think that they don't really add any huge value except for the calendar feature.
Yeah, I like so yeah, Strava is pretty straightforward. I'm sure most people listening to this have used Strava. If you haven't used Training Peaks, I remember I got in there, I was like, there's a lot of metrics, and it's pretty complicated, I thought, and it was really hard to figure out how to use it well. It took me a while to understand. I think you're correct that Strava could easily duplicate most of the features. But once I understood how the like different metrics work. So
Yeah.
Training Peaks offers you the ability to understand how fit you are, how fatigued you are, and how rested you are. They got these three metrics. And I remember like reading the FAQ over and over to try to understand like how they work. So give you like a value at the end of the week, like how fit you are, and trying to understand like how they work together. So after like using it for a long time and using the races and stuff, like I'm actually convinced that the system either works, or I've like used it so much that I've taken my approach in a way that it works because I use the software. Like that's the other thing is like once I started figuring it out and I started like going by what they said, I found it worked, right? Because they have a very specific way to understand how fit you are and how tired you are, and it's the interplay of the two. And
Yeah.
so I did have a high level of fitness, but then tapered and spent time recovering, which my fitness would decline slightly, but I was really well rested. I did get um,
You're
some of the
ready for a good result. Yeah.
some of the best performances ever. So that was what I thought was really interesting. It did seem to actually accurately represent my ability to taper and then race.
Yeah. I think that that is very useful. And like I said, it'll be fairly well correlated with what most athletes experience. It is specifically focused on threshold fitness, so it won't be universally the same use value for different types of athletes that have different goals. And also, like, uh, not everyone recovers on the exact same timeline and has the same tolerance for training loads. So the fact that they have certain algorithms in play means that like your experience will probably be relatively self-similar over time, unless you drastically change the type of training that you're doing. So you could have like a high intensity, low volume training schedule, or you could have like a higher volume, like more moderate intensity training schedule. And Training Peaks might show you drastically different like fitness results just because your TSS was drastically different from day to day. But in fact, like maybe at any given moment, like your fitness results might be the same, like how fast you could do a 20-minute time trial or something like that. But it is very useful. It's just like not as authoritative as they make it sound when they're in their like sales pitch for like what TSS is and what it's supposed to tell you and what CTL is and what it's supposed to tell you.
Yeah, I mean, it was really hard to grasp the concept. That's why I said, like, after a while, I was like, did I just look at this so much? And then was I able to just like interpret the numbers based on my training, right? Because obviously the training is what matters. Like you taper and you have a better performance, right? And so
Yeah.
they seem to be able to measure it. But after a while, I became at least like bought into I don't know if it worked, but I was bought in with like, hey, these seem to really represent what I'm doing. And I got very comfortable with like what that number meant and how I felt. And like
Yeah.
there was enough repeatability where
Yeah.
it worked. It worked for me.
Yeah,
So
totally.
I thought it was cool. And then maybe the last thing we should discuss is like, my watch has a sleep tracker.
Yeah.
I don't use Whoop. That's the other one that has been pretty popular in terms of measuring recovery. You use a sleep tracker too, right?
Yeah.
What do you think about sleep tracking? Like, I mean, I've had a good experience with it, but I'm curious what you think.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's really nice. Any data that we can collect and put to good use is worth collecting and taking a look at. I think sometimes when people get too fixated on like, I don't know, specific metrics in a way that takes their focus off of just like the core principles of like doing good training, doing good recovery, and being the best athlete that they can be with the time that they have allotted, is not necessarily helpful. So like if it's going to waste your time to like get too caught up in the weeds with any given metric, like I wouldn't worry about it. But for me, I really like being able to see objectively like how many hours I'm training over time, how many days I'm training, how much sleep I'm getting, and being able to just check like, oh, like, am I feeling tired because I'm actually training like 2 or 3 hours more this week than I have as a baseline recently? Or am I like getting, 6.5 or 7 hours of sleep average over the last week? And maybe I had like a couple of nights where I actually just like didn't get very much because of whatever, interruption to my sleep occurred. And I feel like it's much easier to tease out what is going on if you have objective measures of anything and everything. So like in principle, I would want to track everything, but only look at the data in a way that was useful, and like to do little investigations, like why am I feeling great this week? Why am I feeling terrible this week? Why am I feeling stressed? And sleep is by far one of the most important aspects of recovery, and one of the most important aspects of our like mental and physical well-being. That if you're feeling stressed and you're not training very well, or you're feeling bad in training, like I would definitely be interested in how much sleep you're getting, and seeing if there's a behavior adjustment that could be made to improve future recovery and future stress management.
When I first got my Garmin, I kept looking at the sleep stuff, and then my my sleep is so consistent that I just don't look at it anymore. Like I sleep generally well every night,
Yeah.
about the same amount of hours, and it's pretty consistent in terms of like I get a little bit more sleep if I train really hard, and if I like have a rest day, I'm actually kind of like can struggle sometimes to go to bed, or it's not as consistent, right? Like I know
Yeah.
like on Monday, my rest day, like when 9 o'clock rolls around, I usually go to bed real early, right? I'm like, oh, I'm not tired, like, and I maybe stay up an extra hour or whatever because like the rest day will affect me,
Yeah.
which is really interesting. But when I look at my sleep data, yeah, it's so consistent that like I always would just joke with myself, like, how do I use this? Like, I don't, like my sleep
But
looks
if you
good.
were traveling, for example, and like your sleep is very different for a week because you had changes on both ends of your travel, or if it's for somebody that does work from home, or works like at a place locally, and they don't travel, they don't have any like kids or dogs or like whatever it is that might disrupt their sleep, then tracking sleep is going to be useless. If they always go to bed at 10 and they always wake up at 6:30, like that's going to be totally useless. But for most people, like it's not that regimented, so there is a potential for getting some value out of like, oh shit, I actually only slept like 6 hours a night last week, when I know that I do much better if I get like at least 7, for example. And I've found that to be the case because there's, as you know, on and off over the last few months, I've had some times where I've been having my sleep disrupted in a way that was not the normal, and I found it to be very useful. Like 6 months ago in the spring, when I was training like 18 to 20 hours a week, and I was like just playing a game of trying to train every day. Like my sleep was very regular, my training was very regular, and I was very busy, but it wasn't like I could get much value out of monitoring my sleep at that time. But sometimes if I'm feeling stressed, if I'm feeling like behind on recovery, I'll look at like how much training I've actually been doing, and how much sleep I've been getting, and those things together can combine to like potentially provide some insights where it's like, oh, actually, I should just make sure that I catch up on sleep this coming week.
All right, I got one last question. Did you ever try a food diary app?
I've never tried a food diary app, but I did like, I used to keep running logs. I used to keep a food diary for a while. And eventually I didn't keep it consistently, but I would like mentally calorie count in my head, and I would periodically do like a food count. And in college once, it wasn't an app, it was like it was like a web 1.0 kind of product, but we had a software program that you would install on your computer, and as a part of a nutritional science class that we had to take a food diary for like a few days, and then do like kind of a deeper analysis of like all the macro and micronutrients that we were getting. It was like kind of fun, I really liked it, but it's tedious, so I haven't used a food tracking app. But that is another thing, like if you saw that your carbohydrate intake was like 70% one week, and then it's like 50% another week, that can make a huge impact on how you're going to feel when you're doing your training. And I feel like that's one thing that goes back to my idea that if you could track everything, that would be amazing. Obviously, you don't want to spend an hour a day just like making notes and like taking photos with your phone and like tracking everything in a way that's not going to be useful. But if in theory it was like zero cost or effort to track everything in your life, then if you saw that there was like some disruption to your training, or you were feeling especially good, you could look at what contributed to that. And any 1 or 2 trackers are not going to tell you that. So like if you have a power meter on your on your bike, like that's great. You can tell like how many kilojoules of training you did. You can tell like how hard your intervals were, but that tells you nothing about what your diet was like, what your sleep was like, what your stress was like when you're at work, and all of those things are going to impact your performance and impact your recovery and impact the overall quality of your training. Like what's the TSS value of losing an hour of sleep? Like there is none, but it is going to add stress to your body that you have to like deal with, you know? And that's, I don't know, that's my view. So tracking is great, but it has to be useful.
I did a food diary app for, I actually did it for a couple years. I was pretty into it.
Did you write down or like select things that you were doing, or was it like a picture based app? Because I think there are some now that you just take pictures with
The
your
one that I
phone.
had, you had to like, you have, you what, the only way I know they work is like you have to enter in everything you
Yeah,
eat. And it
yeah,
did have like a scanner where you could like scan the like the label on a
yeah,
product if it was in the database, right? But if you eat at a restaurant or something, but those things now are usually crowdsourced and like generally like everything will come up. Like it's kind of crazy. Like you
yeah,
go to like a popular restaurant, even like an independent restaurant, not a chain restaurant, and like you'll find people who've estimated the calories for you and stuff. So
yeah,
that part was always really interesting. And yeah, I did it for a while. And like there was a point where it was really useful, like trying to
yeah,
understand
totally.
calories and just get a sense of like, you know, what was it eating and was it healthy? Uh, and then when I got really hardcore about cycling, looking at the food app, I just did two things. I made a commitment to just only eat healthy food. That's when I just quit alcohol. I think quit junk food because like arguably on a bike, you eat a lot of junk food. But
Yeah,
I tried to like, my goal was to make every calorie come from what were generally healthy food, like fruit and vegetables, right? You know, try to eat pretty well. And so I did the calorie counting and I started just ramping up the miles. Like I lost a ton of weight. Like,
yeah,
you know, cause like my diet, uh, compared to like what I eat now was, wasn't as great, right? When I cut out things like alcohol and then cut out all the like snacks and sweets and desserts I ate like during the course of the day, you know, I still love Starbucks. It's like one of my favorite things. Like I love that place, and like I loved eating all kinds of crap at Starbucks and stuff like that. So cutting all of that out, and it's really easy to see on your when you keep a food diary that stuff, right? So the simple act of doing that and then just getting a lot of miles on a bike, like I lost a lot of weight, so that was
yeah,
great.
yeah. I feel like that reminds me of a few like principles that I think about when thinking about like devices and tracking things. Like one, like if you're tracking something, you tend to manage it more. Like if you're tracking your sleep, you'll notice like, oh, I'm not sleeping, I'm not going to bed at the same time, I'm not waking up at the same time. The amount of sleep that I'm getting is fluctuating a lot. So like even without specifically trying, you'll probably end up getting like better sleep. If you're tracking your diet, you're probably just in the act of like writing down the shit that you eat, you're probably just going to tend to eat better, even if you're not like consciously making a big commitment in your head to changing your dietary practices. But if you do, then it's going to be like even augmented more so. And the same with training. Like one thing that I notice a lot with people that I talk to who are looking for consulting work or I'm onboarding as clients, a lot of times like I'll ask them what their training is like. And then once I have some data to look at, looking at Strava or Training Peaks and looking at their history, I'll notice that sometimes people are pretty aware of what they're actually doing, but sometimes they have in their head an idea of what they're doing that is very different than what they're actually doing. And I feel like tracking can help bring some objectivity to our experience that we might not be aware of if we didn't have an external device or app or feedback from the outside looking in at us. Because like, you know, what I think I'm doing may not actually be what I am doing in a way that is very obvious if you're tracking things with a device that you have no power over how it monitors you.
Yeah, I mean, like I couldn't agree more. I think that's generally everyone's attitude about food. If you ask anybody, they'll
Yeah.
tell you that, oh yeah, I eat relatively healthy,
Yeah.
right? Like, is that true or not? Right? Like that's what even I discovered, like with the food app. It's like,
Yeah.
you know, I thought I was healthy. I thought I was in shape and stuff. And then we start trying.
And then you realize half your calories were pastries from Starbucks.
Well, yeah, that's a matter of perspective, right? Like,
Yeah.
is it healthy as I am now? Like, absolutely not, right? So, like,
Yeah.
some of it's
And
relative. Yeah.
and like you said, like as you tracked it and you made dietary changes and you kind of have certain practices in place now, it's less useful to track it. Likewise with your sleep. Like if you're very like religious about how you sleep and like the practices that you have around eating, like if you're doing the same exact thing 95% of the time, like tracking it is not going to be as useful anymore. But if there is some variability, tracking it in some way, if it's not a big time and effort commitment, like can be very useful because you can see like, oh, I actually like am eating very differently or sleeping very differently or whatever it is, and see that.
Yeah, my wife asked me, she's like, why are you not using the calorie app anymore? And I was like, look, I think I used it really religiously for a couple years.
Yeah.
So now I basically know what the calories are and everything. Like I could just tell
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
And I'm not gaining any weight. And my goal is not to lose any weight. I've actually, even during quarantine, I'm like exactly like dead on. Like I couldn't believe it. I was really surprised because like my training changed a little bit. I definitely didn't feel as motivated. I thought I was eating more junk food, but you know, the weight data says that I'm generally in line with what I want to be and where I want to go, right? So I
Yeah.
think having a good sense of how many calories are in something, that was really useful because I do remember
Totally.
clearly, and that was one of the things that really drove me away from alcohol was like the next day. Updating the app with like, oh, did I have 4 cocktails? And you add that in, and you're like, oh my god, like that was a real eye opener for me, right? Because like drinking a lot of wine or whatever, there were things like I really loved, and when I would calculate the calories, I was like, well, that's clearly like not gonna be great for my cycling. Where like eating snacks at Starbucks, I was under no illusion that was like a good idea, right? But everyone wants to believe like, oh, a glass of wine is healthy, and I had a cocktail here. But then when you really start to look at it, you're like, oh, this is like not a good idea. And that was the one where I was like, I still want to eat Starbucks on my ride, and I have a donut every once in a while. But alcohol was the one where I felt like this is not really benefiting my performance
Yeah.
at all. It was making me dehydrated. It was adding all these calories, and so that was the one where I just went cold turkey and decided I could just cut that out and not need that in my life, and I feel great. Like maybe that's even why my sleep is so much more consistent now than it's ever been.
Yeah. Totally. That makes sense.
Well, any final words or?
I don't know. I think I mentioned it a few times during the discussion, but I feel like no matter what it is that people are doing and whatever they're tracking, I feel like it's good to not lose sight of the fact that you want to like be motivated and have good training and track your progress, but it's good to focus on like the core principles of your training and not get too caught up in the weeds in a way that's not helpful. So like any data that you're tracking, you want it to be useful and help you to like take action. I feel like action is um not always the main focus. Like people get caught up. It's like, oh, I spent an hour like looking at my rides on Strava, and it's like, well, you could have spent that hour like training, like checking your times on a climb and like seeing what your trajectory was over the last year or two. That could take like 5 minutes. You can see how your training is going. That's great. Just like have a good plan, implement it, use the data to like augment that experience, but don't get caught up with like over analyzing stuff when most of the time just like going out and training more and being healthy is going to get you the results that you want.
Yeah, I like that advice. Have fun. Well, hey Nate, we've crossed 300 followers. I'm
Yeah.
very excited about that. So of course, like, hey, if you like our content, like and subscribe, leave comments, and we'll be back next week.
Thanks. Bye.